Ladies and gentlemen and Zinesters, congratulations. You're about to embark upon the very last article of the first issue of your zine. So this will be the last major piece you put on your website. It's going to go into your paper zine as well. Since this is the first time I'm pretty sure that you've written a human interest story, it's going to be really important that you follow along closely, focus, keep track of any questions you want to ask me later. You may have written Q&As for other classes. You may have done interview pieces for other classes, but a human interest story is a little bit different. On one hand, it might seem easier. On another hand, it might be more difficult. And I'll point out some examples of where people often go wrong, probably because they're used to writing other types of interview stories before. So stay focused, write down any notes for questions that you want to ask me afterward, and I will do everything I can to help you. First, notice that we have a pretty tight timeline. The full rough draft, about 500 words, is due at the beginning of Thursday's class this week. When is the website due? You are correct. It's due Friday night. So we're on a very tight timeline. It's a deadline week. That's just the way it is right now. So notice there's an exit slip due at the end of class today to tell me how far you managed to get. All right, so first thing first, and this might be the last thing actually that I'm starting with. The last thing that you might do is to add a title to your piece. And the first thing you should know is that the title of a human interest piece should clearly convey the topic. And it should also probably hint at the central problem or the central point of intrigue within your story. And here are just two random examples I pulled off of Google Images. Banker quits to live his railway dreams. Well, that's intriguing. Why would an affluent baker quit his job to become um, a railroad engineer? Short-time job ends after 18 long years. I'm intrigued by the title alone. So your title can be a little bit longer with a human interest piece because it has to almost act as a hook in itself. Also, you need a powerful lead for your story. Um, we're going to look at a couple examples later, but that can include an anecdote that you learn through the interview process, a short story. You can describe the person you interviewed in his or her setting. You can give a description physically of the person if you think that can provide some intrigue for the reader. Maybe you want to start with a quote. I think that's a little less common, though. Don't go to that immediately, but that is an option possibly. Maybe a startling statement, a startling statistic that connects to your paper. Maybe a clever play on words. When we get to the rubric portion, I will show you some more examples of that, but you do need, as always, in the Zines class, when we're doing writing, focus on having a powerful lead. And yes, you do need a picture that goes along with your story. That's actually a pretty big part of it. So you may need to reach out to the person or people you interviewed in order to get a picture they're comfortable with. Don't just pull one off the internet. If this person has pictures on the internet, make sure that they're comfortable with you using it. Okay, so here's the main thing, and this is where people have a hard time because they've done, like I said, maybe Q&As or interview pieces. A human interest story is not. It is not a Q&A piece. And to put that even more directly and simply, your human interest essay should not have your interview questions in the writing at all. So it's not a typed up interview. I know you had some questions that you went into the interview with. Those remain invisible. We never see those in the writing. This has to read like a narrative. It has to read like a story. So all three of these are no-nos. What was your favorite part about being a paramedic? Nope, you can't ask that question. That cannot be in your human interest story. You can't be sneaky about it and do this either. I asked what her favorite part about being a paramedic was, and then you follow that up with a quote. Nope, you cannot have any reference to your questions. Even if you try to use a fancy word like I inquired, no, no means no. So no questions, no indication that you asked a question. So let's go over some examples of maybe what's acceptable and what's not. So pretend these are two paragraphs from the middle of your human interest paper. I asked Sally whom she thought the most frequent uses of vape pens are right now. Definitely kids, she says, blah, blah, blah. Is this acceptable? No, because you indicate your question in the very first paragraph. I asked. You cannot do that. How about this one? So who are the most frequent users of vape pens right now? Second paragraph. Definitely kids, blah, 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 blah. Is this acceptable? Obviously not, because you have the question right in your essay. Can't do that. All right, let's get a little bit more difficult. Here's the first paragraph. Even though vape manufacturers like Juul claim that they market exclusively to adults, Sally and many others believe adults are not the most frequent users. Definitely kids, she says. Adults only use them as a way to wean themselves off cigarettes. Is this success acceptable? Well, there's no question that's directly asked, and the question really isn't implied either. So yes, this is perfect. This is what you're looking for. And I think I've got one more for you. This one's a little tricky. First paragraph. Even though vape manufacturers like Juul claim that they market exclusively to adults, Sally and many others believe kids are the most frequent users and that adults merely use vaping to stop smoking cigarettes. Definitely kids, she says. Adults only use them as a way to wean themselves off cigarettes. Now, you may be tempted to say that this is acceptable because there's no question and there's no implied question. But this is also not acceptable because what you've done in this first paragraph is actually say what the quote says. So the quote says something that you've already said. So you're wasting space and you're being redundant. That is something to avoid. Those are the two major problem areas I see with this paper when they're turned in. That people have a hard time not putting in the questions themselves, and people have a hard time not repeating themselves between their narration and the quotes. So keep that in mind. All right, so I'm going to go to some samples here, and then we'll come back again to what we're doing today. So on Power School, you are going to see the rubric, and you can read this up here. A human interest story puts a person, in your case, at the heart of the entire story. You are the tour guide as the writer. You're not flashy. You're letting the person that you interviewed become the person of interest. You, the writer, are not the person of interest. So you have to remain somewhat invisible, and you have to work with the quotes. Let the quotes do all the heavy lifting. We're looking for about 500 words, and you already know this, that the quotes probably make up about 40% of the text. So here is the story we looked at in class. Trapped in his body for 12 years, a man breaks free. This is what it looks like. This is how long it is. Now, this is what it looks like when I've highlighted. If this comes up for me. And it doesn't look like it's going to come up to me. All right, so I'll come back to that. But anyway, 40% roughly of the paper is made up of quotes. So that means out of the 500 words in your essay, about 200 words of those 500 are made up of just the quotes from your interview. So really, you yourself are only writing 300 words. That sounds easy, but I just went over those major pitfalls that people fall into. All right, so let's go down here. Got to have a lead. There's a link here on the rubric. You can click on it too, and you are going to see some examples. The anecdote or short story lead. You can put in some ideas here. Richard Leakey likes to tell about the day in 1950 when he was a 6-year-old whining for his parents' attention, blah, 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 blah. Another type of lead is the narrative lead. This is a very popular one. They pulled the 58 Buick to the side of Pitts Avenue, turned off the motor, and waited silently as the memories washed over them in a series of gentle waves. Maybe that's a little too much at the end, but you get the point. It just paints a picture. It's telling a story. Descriptive scene setter. This is very similar to the previous one, but you're just painting a scene maybe of where the interviewer is. A woman with tormented eyes talks to herself as she plays a battered piano in Ward D's stateroom. You can read the rest. Maybe a significant detail. Hidden beneath a heap of inner tubes in a tiny storeroom on an island in the middle of the Vistula River is the statue of Lenin that stood for decades. So those are just four. And any one of those four are highly useful. Let's see here. I'd like to introduce y'all to. When you introduce your person, you should mention the person's age immediately. You should include a touch of physical description, something unique that we can sort of hang our imaginations on and picture. Something like a handlebar mustache, that sure is unique. The way the person wears her glasses, her eyeglasses, or the way he wears his hat, or the way he sits in his chair. Something unique. You don't need to describe the entire person. Really important, again, quotes do the heavy lifting. And we already went over that. The 40% means that 200 words of the 500 are made up of quotes. Organization, does the writer structure the piece so that a story is told from beginning to end? That's difficult. Are there adequate bridges or transitions between main points or quotes? Are the paragraphs super short and easily digestible? And then the big thing I was trying to drive home, not structured like a Q&A. Can't do it. You have to have a conclusion. Again, you can use that full circle technique. So if you start off the piece with a description, maybe you come back to that same description at the end and tweak it a little bit and leave us with something to think on. And then in terms of conventions, I mean, your grammar is part of this too. But when you quote people, you're using present tense in the human interest piece. And you are, most of the time, 90% of the time, I'd say, you're just using says. Martha says, Bob says, etc., etc. Keep it simple, because you don't want to outshine the quotes by using a nice big fancy word here instead of says. Let's see if this is working yet. Ah, there we go. But it's not highlighted. Okay, that's okay. So let's zoom in here. So notice the title. Again, it's a little longer, but it tells the story. You know what the story is. It provides some intrigue because of the problem and how someone overcomes that problem. The hook is posed in this case as a series of questions. That's okay. But they also include a little bit of description here in the beginning. So look at the specific detail. Late 80s, name, place, things like electronics, resistors, transistors. And notice how quickly they transition to the problem here. But at age 12, his life took an unexpected turn. Now it's about to get intriguing. Notice how short the paragraphs are. Super short. Much shorter than even the op-ed that you did earlier in the trimester. Here's your first quote, and if I highlighted every single quote from here on out, it would be about 40% of the paper. Notice his mother says, just keeping it really simple, says, which follows the person's name or title. Short, short, short. And so you can see that there's not a chunk of dialogue or a quote from the interview that takes up multiple paragraphs or a big chunk of the page. Little snippets. Then the writer comes back in. Then a little snippet. Then the writer comes back in. Little snippet. Then the writer comes back in. So that's the formula, essentially, of making sure that this reads like a story. And as long as you do that without putting your questions in or indicating your question, most of the time it's going to read well. So putting this thing together is a little bit like putting a puzzle together. You have 40% of the puzzle pieces, and you have to make 60% of the puzzle pieces and figure out the best order of putting everything in. the best two-word paragraph in the entire piece, like Barney. Snippet of the quote, a little bit of the writer, a little bit of the writer, snippet of the quote, a little bit of the writer. So back and forth, back and forth. This is a great model to look at. So just going back to the PowerPoint then. Today, you want to make sure you have your 40% of quotes that you should have turned in by Sunday night. If you didn't have them ready by Sunday night, hopefully you have them now. If you don't have those quotes picked out from the audio of your interview, that is absolutely mission critical, number one thing you want to do. If you have those, then you literally need to open a Google Doc and start pulling the quotes over into the Google Doc, arranging them, and then starting to write in your narration all around them throughout the paper. So in a way, it's much different than writing a traditional essay. I hope you find a way to have fun with it. If you feel yourself getting frustrated, please ask me a question over email or Zoom, and I will help you out. But as always, use that sample. That sample is a great model.